This week, we're dealing with some assumed false identities, either for nefarious reasons or because of a possible disorder. Olga Cumberland. Hazel Agatha Johnson was the daughter of George Johnson of St. Louis, Missouri. When Hazel was 6 or 7 years old, she went to Florida in 1901 with George's then parents-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Reuben R. Leisnoy, aka Hazel's grandparents. I don't know the circumstances of this arrangement. In one place it was because Hazel's mother had died, which makes sense since this appeared to be a more permanent type of arrangement. Anyway, eventually George would hear of Reuben's death. George tried to find his daughter Hazel for years. When he finally heard from her 2 years ago, letters would be exchanged, talking about future reunions. George was sending the letters to Hazel in care of Olga Cumberland, age 25 or so. Hazel would be about 23 or so years old and was rooming with Olga at the time, who was allegedly married but separated from her husband. And then, early January 1924, Olga would be arrested for obtaining goods from department stores under false pretenses. And the you-know-what would hit the proverbial fan. The deception started when Olga saw a magazine advertisement put in by George Johnson regarding his missing daughter. According to Olga, quote, Hazel got pneumonia while we were working in New York. When she knew she was going to die, she made me promise not to tell her parents. That is why, for 2 years, I have been writing her parents in her name. They thought all along she was working for the government as a typist, end quote. So, seeing this ad by Hazel's father, George, and knowing her alleged promise to Hazel, she starts writing Hazel's family as Hazel. And besides that, she also collected $295 in benefits, $195 of which she allegedly spent to bury Hazel. Another newspaper said that she had to use some of her own money for that as well. All those letters exchanged, and the many excuses Olga had to send the parents as to why she couldn't go visit them. Olga was, at this point in time, rooming with a Grace Harding. Olga was using Grace's name in the purchase of $200 worth of items at 2 different department stores. Things came to light regarding Hazel when Grace, questioned about the department store charges, had also become increasingly disturbed by the mail arriving for Hazel in care of Olga. So she told detectives of her concern. Detectives questioned Olga, and that's how they learned of the 2-year-long deception. We're about 10 days later. This is what Olga is now saying, and boy, does it really make me hate her a lot. I do not promote violence, but a chancla to her head would do me a world of good. Quote, it was during an unfortunate dull moment about 6 months ago when I ran across an advertisement in a section of a detective story magazine devoted to inquiries as to persons who have disappeared from their friends. The advertisement was from Mr. and Mrs. George Johnson. I sat down and wrote an answer to it, just to see what would come of it. It said that Hazel Johnson's mother died when she was 7 years old and that she had been left with her mother's mother, who went to Florida later. Her father, losing contact with his mother-in-law, now grieving, was seeking his daughter. I think the name of the mother's folks was Lysenbees. I wish I had that ad to show you. Well, back comes an answer. I replied and sent an old picture of myself. That picture was about the same as the one the police sent to Mr. and Mrs. Johnson to identify, end quote. The Johnsons would say that picture was their daughter Hazel, but they hadn't seen Hazel in 20 years, and perhaps the sheer hope that they had finally found their missing daughter may have made them not see things as clearly as they should. Quote, I know it was foolish to do such a thing, but I thought I'd try it for the novelty of it. I gave them an idea I was their daughter, and they wrote back wanting me to come there. I told them I was going to New York with friends. They wrote back and told me all about the little automobile they had and how they were keeping up payments on it and so forth. Well, when I got into this trouble, and it's the first time I ever did anything like that, the police started to go into this Hazel Johnson case, so I had to kill her to stop the investigation. I told them Hazel died in New York 3 months ago, and I buried her with funds from the insurance company. That was all a joke, and I told the police that so they would stop going into Hazel Johnson's affairs. As a matter of fact, I've never seen Hazel. Don't know her, didn't bury her, and wasn't even in New York at that time. I've been here in Washington all the time since 1920. And now it's terrible. I'm out of work and nobody will give me a job." End quote. Oh my word, I wonder why. Maybe because you were passing off fake checks and you lied to a poor family about their missing daughter. In case that was a lot to grasp. Basically, Hazel and Olga were never roommates, were never friends. They never knew each other at all. They never lived in the same city. Olga never buried her, assuming never got her insurance money. This means Hazel's whereabouts are still unknown. Anywho, Olga had an unfortunate marriage. Her husband took her money and left. Quote, "I know I ought not to be kicking, but I can't help think that if I had a good break in getting married, all this wouldn't be happening. Why can't I get some of the luck some girls have showered on them? Oh well. Oh, yes, I wish you'd tell the police I don't want to go to headquarters anymore. Will you? They really treated me very courteously and very nicely. Detectives King and Cox did, and I appreciate it. And Inspector Grant was nice too. But I'd rather let this explanation be enough for them. Do you think it will?" End quote. Regarding the fraud checks, she's denying the charges, but then later would plead guilty. She's been sentenced with 4 charges of false pretenses. The sentence is 30 days in jail for each charge. However, the sentence has been suspended. She's been put on probation and will be sent home to New Jersey where her parents live. Judge McMahon to Olga, quote, "Your actions in the past have been somewhat mysterious, but a careful investigation by the police has revealed no previous criminal record. You have been away from home for some time, and I'm afraid that you have been drifting towards the bottom of the ladder. Your parents have been communicated with, and they are willing to forgive and help you. The court is going to sentence you to serve 30 days in jail on each of the 4 charges of false pretenses and suspend sentence. You will be placed on probation on condition that you go home, but you must live there, for if you leave, you will be taken into custody and made to serve the sentence imposed." End quote. Oh, and according to one newspaper, Olga Cumberland ain't her real name either. George Johnson, Hazel's father, said, quote, "I'm going to keep on searching and searching. 100 deceptions, 1,000 false scents couldn't discourage me. I'll look for Hazel till I die." End quote. So was Hazel Johnson found? Once again, I couldn't find anything in the newspapers, but I had many questions because it's just odd to me a bit, and I'm sure there's more to the story than the newspapers were never told. Not so much that Hazel went to Florida to her grandparents, but what happened after that? When did her grandparent or grandparents die? Had Hazel gone missing before then? Why wasn't she writing any letters to her father between the times she allegedly went to Florida and when Olga caused the ruse? If Hazel had disappeared before the death of at least one grandparent, why hadn't that been communicated to anyone? I mean, I kind of get why Olga didn't get in trouble for this part of it, though she should have somehow. I guess because Olga didn't get any money from Hazel or the family. But she stole their hopes, which to me is the worst part of it all. I definitely have no closure with this story, but I hope in reality that Hazel's family did find some. Harry Wolff. This story starts towards the end, and it's November 1923, and it starts off in the newspapers with the wrong information. The United States Shipping Board in Buenos Aires, Argentina, states that they have been defrauded of some 400,000 pesos from wrongful manhandling of their financial books. The real amount would take some time to be found out, but that's the cost they think it is as of now. This discovery was made after the suicide of Jacob Arnoff, general accountant. While he was being looked for by police, he took his own life. Arnoff had arrived in Buenos Aires some 3 years earlier from Arkansas. Except his real name is not Jacob Arnoff. His real name is Harry Wolff. If you need to take a slight snicker at his name, you can. It's okay. I can't hear you. Or can I? Harry, before taking his own life, wrote a letter of confession to Captain Roach of the Shipping Board. He said in the letter that he was not Jacob Arnoff of Arkansas. He was Harry Wolff of New Orleans. Jacob Arnoff left his home in Arkansas to go and visit Harry, a friend of his who lived in New Orleans. A few weeks later, they sailed together for South America and came to Buenos Aires 3 years earlier. Then at some point, Jacob and Harry had been out canoeing, and Jacob had fallen overboard and drowned. Harry made for the police station to report the accident, and then he started thinking devious criminal thoughts that I'm sure at the time seemed like a great idea. Instead of going on to the police like he should have, he went to Jacob's room. Harry believed he fairly resembled Jacob a bit in looks and took Jacob's papers and his passport, and he became Jacob. Harry/fake Jacob became employed by the U.S. Shipping Board. From Harry's suicide letter, quote, I decided to make as much as possible out of the fraud. I drew on his bank account. I wrote to his father asking for money. The old man sent me money until I asked for $25,000. Then he protested and notified the American consul at Buenos Aires. I fooled the latter with the passport and the acid scar. End quote. Jacob had a scar on his face. Harry had actually used acid to burn a matching scar onto his face. He started embezzling, not only under Jacob's name, but under other employees' names as well. Quote, I got 400,000 pesos. I could have taken 250,000 more. Captain Maloney should be found to be 100,000 pesos short in his accounts. Captain Roch, 100,000. Captain Cardins, 5,000. I took it all. End quote. Captain Roch discovered some financial discrepancies and went to the bank to start an examination, and that's when Harry ran when he realized that the jig was about to be up. All he had in his pockets at the time of his death was 22 pesos. The rest he had lost at the nearby racetrack. The Argentina police and the shipping board don't believe the story at this point. They think that the so-called Harry was actually Jacob Arnoff. Harry confessed in his letter to clear the name of his supposedly accidentally deceased friend, Jacob. The police are waiting for Jacob's brother, David, to arrive into Buenos Aires from New York to identify the body of what we're assuming now is Harry. In other words, to state, no, this isn't my brother, Jacob. To my knowledge, Jacob's body was never found. I don't know in what body of water they were canoeing in. The Arnoff family said that the newspaper stories have served to clear up a mystery that they've been dealing with for 3 years. Cablegrams and letters from the fake Jacob with strange phrasing and no mention ever of Jacob's other 4 brothers and sisters, aside from his sister Esther. Photographs sent to them with someone in them that only vaguely resembled Jacob, and by demands for large amounts of money. Before the real Jacob drowned November 7, 1920, Jacob had written home frequently to his father. And then after November, the letters stopped for 6 months, and then when they started up again, the difference in handwriting was noticeable. Early in 1921, the fake Jacob asked for $500 from his father. In 1922, $250. August 1923, a cablegram was sent to Jacob's father. Quote, I need $25,000 at once. Failure to send means disgrace to the family. Cable funds at once. Do not send check. Jacob. End quote. Now, Jacob's father was already suspicious before this, and he actually went to the Colorado governor's office. And after he wrote a letter, the State Department told him not to send any more money to this so-called Jacob. An investigation was already disclosing some interesting items. But October 9th, 1923, fake Jacob asked for $7,500 to the U.S. consul. Mr. Arnoff asked the consul to positively identify that this was the real Jacob. The consul said, positively identified Jacob. He declines to tell why money is needed, but urgently requests that you send by cable at once. End quote. Wait, what? Well, as mentioned, Harry had a bit of a resemblance, and he had burned into his face a scar that supposedly matched Jacob's, so the consul was like, yeah, that's him, sure. Then October 21st, less than 2 weeks later, fake Jacob asked for $25,000. Quote, answer yes or no, Jacob, end quote. And that was the last of the correspondence because for Jacob's father, at least, the jig was up, regardless of what the consul had said. November 27th, Captain Roch is heading to Washington regarding the loss of money, saying that fake Jacob had destroyed all of the ledgers and that it would be impossible to say how much was stolen until the accounts of the Buenos Aires office on record with Washington were compared with those of the bank into which the shipping board's deposits were made. So we already know the suspicions that Jacob's family was experiencing. Here is where the deception came forward for the actual shipping board. Evening Star, November 27th, 1923. Quote, "It is learned that the exposure of Wolf's 3 years of fraudulent operations emanated from an inquiry from Washington as to why, according to the Washington accounts, the Buenos Aires office of the shipping board was carrying such a large bank balance in pesos. This seems strange to Captain Rauch, as the actual balance in the bank at the time was only 40 pesos. The discovery was then made that Wolf had deposited in pesos instead of dollars after cashing shipping board drafts, and at the recent exchange rate, this netted him 200 pesos on every $100. Captain Rauch declared that, like his 3 predecessors in office, he had trusted implicitly the man he supposed to be Jacob Arnoff. His books apparently were flawless." End quote. Captain Rauch, hearing what Jacob's father had to say, is indeed now believing that fake Jacob is Harry. One of the oddities that helped the captain believe it was that Harry refused to join the local Masonic lodge, even though he wore a Masonic ring. According to Harry's final letter, the ring belonged to Jacob. Within Harry's effects were also unopened letters from the Arnoff family, who thought they were writing to Jacob. Now, once again, no update to this story. I assume that David Arnoff, Jacob's brother, arrived in Buenos Aires and identified the body as not Jacob. So then these suspicions would have been confirmed that Harry Wolf had stolen Jacob's identity and wrote this letter just before he took his own life to clear his friend's name. Harry had taken his own life when the investigation got too close. Jacob had died accidentally. The true crime part of my brain wonders more at Jacob's death. Was it really an accident? Had Harry already started scheming before this trip and decided to take Jacob out? We'll probably never know, and I just hope that wasn't the case. Elizabeth Anthony, 1912. And our last story is regarding a woman who apparently had aphasia. Now, I'm not sure that the definition of aphasia then is the same as now. Now it means, quote, "Aphasia is a disorder that results from damage to portions of the brain that are responsible for language. For most people, these areas are on the left side of the brain. Aphasia usually occurs suddenly, often following a stroke or head injury, but it may also develop slowly as a result of a brain tumor or a progressive neurological disease. The disorder impairs the expression and understanding of language as well as reading and writing. Aphasia may co-occur with speech disorders such as dysarthria or apraxia of speech, which also result from brain damage." End quote. That's according to the NIH's National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders. A Mrs. Anthony, resident of Philadelphia and I believe around 60 years old, went missing February 1908, 4 years earlier. She had left her house to head to the home of her son to take a present to her granddaughter, and I'm assuming from the short article I read that she had made it to the son's house, but she never came back home. Though obviously details are hard to come by, we do know she ended up in Baltimore. She would not remember her name, would not know how she got to Baltimore, except she believed somehow that she had been evicted from her home and she had shown up here in the city to earn a living. She was hesitant to ask for help, thinking that anyone who heard her appeals would think she had lost her mind. She looked at lists of names, trying to see if one leaped out at her as being hers, but to no avail, and she would come to the conclusion that she was on her own, had no friends, and would have to support herself. Oddly, somehow she took a job as a trained nurse under an assumed name, though she had never had any nursing training. She would assist at operations and received accolades from doctors for her work. Back home, her husband would search and search for her, using his time and money to try to find her. Nothing worked. No clue came forth, and on the 3rd anniversary of her disappearance, he collapsed. From what specifically, I don't know, and would soon pass away, convinced his wife had been murdered. That is just so heartbreaking. His death notice, oddly enough, is what triggered her memory, and memories would start to come back for her. But she feared if she revealed herself at this point in time, people would think it was only because of his estate. And to explain what had happened to her, they would think she had also lost her mind. So unfortunately, she decided that if they thought she was dead, she should stay dead until his estate had been settled among the heirs, and she would reveal all once that was done. So once his estate had been finalized, and I don't know how long that took, she finally communicated with friends in Wilmington, Delaware, and then touched base with her son before her story became public. So what triggered this episode? Had she fallen and hit her head on the way back home from the son's house? Or something else considered traumatic, like being hit by a car, for example? I don't know. The brain is a fascinating thing. I'm sorry that her husband died thinking she'd been murdered, that her family was without her for 4 years, only able to imagine the worst. And I can't even fathom what she went through, not knowing what her own name was, much less anything else. And she started over her life completely. So, what do you think about these stories? Olga, in her early 20s and married but sounds extremely naive. Her ultimate intention may have been to help a sad father, but all she did was amuse herself and make his situation 1,000 times worse in the end. Harry, scheming for money, used his friend's name in his crime and defrauded the company he worked for, lied to Jacob's family, but at least cleared his friend's name in the end, and brought Jacob's family a tiny bit of closure of knowing the alleged truth about what had actually happened to Jacob. And then our final story, just sad all the way around. I hope Elizabeth's family was able to help her reconnect with herself and with them and help her through the grief of having lost her husband in the interim. Thank you for being part of the channel. I don't only report on murder, so if you also enjoy hearing stories of this nature, I do these periodically, so please like and subscribe. See you.